Thank you, and good afternoon. We have two guests that really don't need an introduction today, but I will give you a couple highlights briefly so that we can spend more time with our speakers. Eric Eskola and I met some time ago, but we did go on a trip to Canada last fall, and we got to talking about politics as one of our favorite topics. Most of you know that Eric has for 30 years was on WCCO radio talking politics, interviewing various state officials and national people. And he's still on Twin Cities PBS on the Almanac show, which is 33 years. He co-hosts that with Kathy Wurzer. So Eric and I talked about the fact that maybe we could get Governor Carlson to come and do an Almanac-like interview here. Eric has got all kinds of good questions for the governor. And then we'll open it up and we can ask questions. Governor, and I know some of this has been published in the bulletin and some of the background will come out after today, but I'll just welcome his wife, Susan Carlson, here too. They're both Rotarians from Punta Gorda, Florida, residents of Minnesota, but spending the winters in Punta Gorda, north of Fort Myers on the Gulf Coast. And thing I remember about Governor Carlson, he served 8 years in the 90s, 91 to 98 or 9, was that he closed the schools for a really cold day. In 1996, it was 30 below in Minneapolis, and it was 60 below in Tower, Minnesota. So he found it important to close the schools in the state of Minnesota on that day in 1996. That's probably the biggest accomplishment that, no, Arne, that's not true. I mean, he inherited a $2 billion deficit, made that a $2 billion surplus, funded tax cuts for Minnesotans, regained our AAA bond rating, reduced workers' comp premiums by 40%. Terrific governor during those years, and he hasn't stopped working for the benefit of other people. So, without any further ado, I'd like the two of them to come up. I'll give them each a microphone. Eric Eskola there, Governor Arne Carlson. Welcome.
Governor, let's go into the time machine to 1992, and I want you to reminisce a little bit, but then look present and future. Have you noticed, folks, I don't know how much you pay attention to the legislature and the process there, but do you get the sense that it's kind of dysfunctional? Just a little? 1992, bipartisan group of House and Senate members get together in a room, no lobbyists. I think you gave them two directions. Come up with a health care plan for those that are too rich to qualify for subsidized programs, but too poor to afford private insurance, and come up with a way to pay for it. They got in a room. They came up with a bipartisan, bicameral plan, passed the House narrowly, but passed the Senate by quite a bit. We don't seem to get the bipartisan cooperation for big ticket, big ideas, innovations, reform. Why could it happen then, and why doesn't it happen as often now?
Well, I hate to correct Eric on history, but in this instance, I think it would be fairly informative. It did not start out by any means as a bipartisan or kumbaya moment.
Thank you, everybody.
But I think it's informative in the sense that when these problems arise, the question becomes, how do you want to handle it? First of all, we had an enormous deficit. Two, both houses of the legislature were controlled by the Democrats. Three, they were not particularly tickled to have me in the governorship. So it was not a romantic relationship, not by a long shot. And we had a very, very tough session. We made mistakes on our part. They kind of overextended themselves in their criticism on their part. But we finally were able to close the budget gap. But there were several things that were done there that I think are important. The first was a real insistence and ultimately an agreement on long-term financial planning. We wanted to put an end to all of these ups and downs, and then the powers to be announcing, oh, I'm surprised. When you're in financial planning business, you have no business being surprised, and if you are surprised, get out. So what we wanted to do was create a pattern of understanding at least 5 years out. We also wanted the legislature to understand when they fund a program today, that program has a tendency to grow. And they had a habit of not putting money aside for that growth. And the result was, again, another form of surprise. Well, suffice it to say, as we came to the close of the session, a group of Democrats passed a health care bill. It was largely a single-payer system that left a deficit of $500 million with instructive language that said the governor shall report back in January of next year with the funding source. Well, anytime you're stuck with the funding source, it's kind of like the pirate, you know, walking out as they got a sword to your back.
They were making you the bad guy. Is that the idea?
I think you catch on, Eric. No, and the minute I vetoed the bill, it was kind of like poking a beehive. Literally thousands of protesters instantly were upon the Capitol with all these marvelous placards calling me every single name in the book. I mean, it was astounding. Obviously, this thing had been well planned. But suffice it to say, from that moment, things changed. And I think this is where it becomes very instructive. First of all, the opposition party has a right to, quote, oppose. How far they go is questionable. Secondly, the governor's office has a responsibility for being able to introduce legislation and make sure that he properly sells it to the public. Having said that, what we did from there on in was call in Marlene Marshall, who was our Commissioner of Health, and she was a woman that was brought in because she started out as a nurse in Ramsey County Hospital and worked herself up to chief administrator. She never got the credit that she deserved. She was an example of a person who came into the public sector with both talent and deep concern. And I asked her to put together a modest demonstration project, which is all we could afford at the time, with certain stipulations, certain guidelines as to what it was that we wanted. She then huddled, put together a staff, and started meeting with Democrats and Republicans and came back with a proposal in December of 1991. And I'll never forget, we had the room adjacent to the governor's office. What is that called again?
The reception room?
The reception room, yes.
You were only there 8 years.
I know. But at my age, your memory gets a little foggy. But suffice it to say, the reception room was packed, and obviously some Democrat leaders were there as well. And we announced the program. And much to the shock of everybody, there was kind of a coming together. And that was the administration is serious about getting it done. The legislature is serious about getting it done. Can we now, in fact, coalesce? And there was a coalescing, and that's what Eric talked about. But the point is, when you start to get people to work together in the same room, all of a sudden the differences start to dissipate and the areas of agreement have a tendency to grow.
But you kept lobbyists out of the room, as I remember.
We kept all lobbyists out of the room. We kept our people in, we kept their people in, we kept information flowing, and it worked out very well.
And you also had a way to pay for it. You had the provider tax at 2%.
Well, that was insistence.
Well, that was one of your conditions, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'll never forget, it was a visit from Kurt Johnson, who was our policy director, and I thought it was very, very well done. And that was that we did not want to get the funding source outside the system because that would then subject it to the ups and downs, as you can understand. But rather, if we could keep it inside the system, it would put some pressure on the system itself to be more cost efficient. And so we imposed what was called a 2% provider tax. And I'll never forget, I got a call from the Mayo Clinic. And I went down and I visited them, and they were very concerned because they are international in terms of their constituency. And I made a deal with them. I said, look, if after 1 year this really imposes a harmful burden on you, we'll revisit the issue. But just give us 1 year to settle it down. And they agreed. Never heard from them again.
And you put a nickel on the cigarettes? Was that the other thing you did?
And then we put a tax on cigarettes. By the way, that's the one thing I regret. We should have put a much, much bigger tax on cigarettes.
Well, okay, so this happens, it passes the House narrowly, big margin in the Senate. Why can't those elements that you described be used now in the current day and going forward? What has changed that makes that less likely to happen?
Well, I think our job as an administration was to try to work with those legislators that they were there largely for policy purposes.
And now, and these
well,
days?
Let me finish if I may.
Go ahead.
I think there's been a change, and it's been a change in the public attitude as well. I'm looking at Jim Casserly, who is a Democrat from the North Side, an extraordinarily capable legislator. I mean that sincerely, very, very capable. But when you have those kinds of people who care first about people and care about policy and put that first instead of politics and fighting, you'll always win, because it's easy to bring them together to coalesce. You do the same thing in business. And it works extraordinarily well. Today we have an electorate, frankly, that all too often sends up the sharpest, nastiest, most uncompromising person they possibly can to go there and fight. And then we're shocked that they fight. And they wouldn't know policy of any sort if they tripped over it. And so the result is there's an absence in the American discussion, there's an absence of public policy. If you want to know about good healthcare systems, you look at Switzerland or Denmark or Sweden, whatever. And we never do that. We always assume if it's here, it's got to be the best. And the truth of the matter is, it is not the best. And we can't have a public policy discussion without some instant retaliation, labeling. And with social media has opened up something that we don't know how to control, and that is the opportunity not just to exaggerate, we've always done that, but to blatantly lie. And we don't know how to handle it. Technology has outstripped our capacity to, in fact, govern. And so we can't sit down as a nation and have a thoughtful discussion on anything without bricks being thrown. So we're going to have to revisit, and clubs like this have to play a role in starting to define what are our expectations in a democracy. Can we, in fact, have a civil discourse? Can we honor the right of people to disagree? Can we welcome people who look differently than from us?
Seems to me that when you had divided government back in your 8 years, seems to me it worked pretty well. And I think now part of the problem is that we're kind of a 50-50 state and nation, and there's really not much will to compromise on either side. And when you have 50-50 and no compromise, the process doesn't work hardly at all. I heard a reporter the other day who covers the Capitol say, and I wrote it down even, he said that the legislative session is devolved into a series of news conferences which allow politicians to mark time between campaigns. That's a pretty strong indictment. Campaign finance, would that help? Some campaign finance reform, or?
Well, I think we always look for some magical solution, usually pass another law or amend the Constitution. So I tend to be a little bit skeptical of that. I think it gets down to us as a people and as members of political parties, and that is, what in the world do we expect from our government? One, let's learn to respect it. In my lifetime, I can say this. When John Kennedy summoned the best and the brightest, it rang. People, particularly young people, responded. We all felt that government was elevated. Government was a place that you went to serve for the betterment of the community as a whole. People like Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not only old, people forget he was a chain smoker when he came into the White House. He barely had a single night where he could sleep through the night because his stomach was in such agony. But he felt very sincerely that he was the one person in the post-World War II era that could unite this country and make them work together. And he used the bully pulpit remarkably well to bring Democrats and Republicans both in lines. For those of you that are Republicans, I can tell you Eisenhower had very bitter feelings towards Republicans in those days, as he did to the Democrats. But the name of his game was to go right to the people and use his power with the people to bring both of them in line.
Do you all have questions? If you do, I got 3 pages of them, but if anybody wants to hop in with a question.
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah.
I just want to introduce another person, Bob Erickson, who was the finance director for the University of Minnesota, later on MNSCU. But when we can draw that kind of talent into our system, we win. And when we keep denigrating those people who go into public service and call them worthless, useless bureaucrats, why are we shocked that we don't attract the best and the brightest? And by the way, if we were to abolish bureaucracies, we'd have an unemployment rate of 80%.
Eric, you were just up at the convention up in Duluth for the Republicans and the Democrats were in Washington.
Yeah, I spent a great day Saturday with the Republican convention. It was just a blast, a lot of fun. It was. It really was. It was fun.
Each party now has a nominee, and each party also has a well-known person running in the primary. How does the governor feel about this situation?
Well, it's yet another body blow to the endorsement process. And Governor Carlson at least tied a record, and he may have said it, as a 2-term governor who was never endorsed by his party. In fact, he'll be too modest to tell you this, but when he challenged, Alan Quist challenged him in '94.
Yes.
And many of the delegates, and he had enough guts to show up and speak, but many of the Quist delegates, if this is the governor speaking, they turned their back on him. Do you recall that?
Oh, I recall an awful lot of backs, yes.
Well, this endorsement process is kind of withering on the vine, isn't it?
I certainly hope so. First of all, it's fundamentally not very democratic. What you really want are open primaries where we celebrate the right of choice. And that's what both political parties need. I thought you saw in this convention on both the Republican and Democrat side, the Republicans have skewed themselves very sharply to the right. So there's a certain amount of uniformity and agreement on that side. The Democrats, on the other hand, are kind of all over the place, and they skewed themselves this time to the left. Usually the purpose of putting together a ticket is to balance interests in order to win elections. The one thing you notice was absent from the overall discussion was winnability. And what is the purpose of running if you intend to lose? And so I think, certainly on the Democrat side, I think their ticket is in very serious trouble. Yeah.
Maybe following on that same line, Governor, when you chose your running mate, you chose somebody from a mid-sized town outside the immediate metropolitan area, which has been the tradition, but the Democrats chose not to do that in this case. Do you see more than symbolic value in having that rural-urban balance, which has been traditional, in terms of getting another voice, for a little different perspective? Even if you don't, do you think the symbol is valid?
I think that's an excellent question. Thank you very much. No, I think it has extraordinary value. I remember in our staff meetings, both Jonelle Deerstead, who was my lieutenant governor, and I remember Bernie Oman, who commuted from St. Cloud, would always give me the rural viewpoint on virtually everything. When I would get agitated on certain kinds of subsidies, Bernie would always remind me of the fabulous value that we have in agriculture, et cetera. So no, I just think it's extremely valuable to have the input there. Because the truth is, ultimately, you're governing people in Detroit Lakes just as you're governing people in Bloomington. And one of the themes that I hope that comes out of this election are candidates that will focus on what is it we can do to bring more jobs to greater Minnesota. because we here in the metropolitan area are suffering from congestion. And I can't believe we want to have more people move out, and I think they would very much want to have more people move in. And so I hope there is a discussion on that, because of all the issues that we confront as a state, I think that frankly is the most important.
Go ahead.
Governor, one of the major issues on the national level is gerrymandering.
Oh.
There's a couple of cases, and be interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
It is so fundamentally unfair to use your incumbency for the purpose of denying the voters proper choice. It's really fundamentally undemocratic. Legislative bodies have no business whatsoever being given the right or the authority to draw their own lines. And that should always go to an independent body. Al Quie and Walter Mondale have been working together on that for years. They've come up with all sorts of solutions that involve a bipartisan commission consisting of judges to draw the line. That is the appropriate way to go. The legislature on both sides of the aisle clearly doesn't want it, so it doesn't fly, and we haven't had governors in recent years that pushed it.
And the courts generally end up doing Minnesota's lines anyway. But anybody else? Yes, sir.
Right now, primaries are held during prime vacation time, doesn't help the turnout. Suppose they would move to September, or we move to ranked choice voting. Would either of those help or hurt?
Well, here's how I would answer. One, no doubt about it, it should be post-Labor Day. And that has to happen if you really want people to show up at the polls.
How about June? How about June?
Well, you could do it in June, or you can do it in September. The reason I like September is I think it shortens the campaign season, but that may be wishful thinking. But the second thing is more intriguing, ranked voting. I tend to be a supporter of it, and the reason is this. I kind of think when you have to rank votes, it has the impact of making certain that candidates are less inclined to be extreme, because they realize that maybe I can't be your first choice, but I'd like to be your second choice. And therefore, there'll be less attacks and less extreme rhetoric. I think it may be a way to push both political parties back to where they were that Eric was talking about, where Republicans were center-right, and Democrats were center-left. You can always govern on a coalition basis with that. But when you get the extremist, then you're going to get what you have now. So I would be inclined to support both propositions.
Yes, sir.
A quick question. You might have already covered this, but I've noticed through the years that there's far more politicians than there are statesmen. How do you get the best and the brightest that want to govern or get into politics?
No, I think it's not only a fair question, it's the first question we as a society should ask. Let me ask you this. Suppose you're 18 and you're in high school, and all you see on the media is this pounding from people who participate in the political system, demonizing those who go into public service. Are you likely to say, gee, that's what I want to do? No. So I go on Facebook once in a while. I'm stunned at some of the comments some of these candidates make. I wonder what zoo was unlocked.
Yeah, I recently had a guy come to my door and ask for money, funding at the Capitol.
Funding what?
Funding for Capitol. And I said, I don't have any desire to give any money to, I don't trust government.
You remember Jen Olson from state senator from Minnetrista? When I first got up there in the early 80s, I was talking to her one afternoon, and she said, Eric, there's an old saying that there's no limit to what we can accomplish if we don't care who gets the credit. And I thought, and then she said quickly, and that's never been heard up here at the Capitol. And I think that's part of the problem. It's kind of there's no I in team, and there's a lot of I up there.
Yeah. Let me also say this before we close, because it's the kind of comment that's going to draw an awful lot of criticism. I came to Minnesota in 1957 for graduate school with the intent of staying here, and this is a remarkable state. And what was remarkable about it is that virtually all of our institutions, private and public, were all geared to one goal, and that is, how do we get Minnesota recognized? How do we become the best state? CCO Radio, Eric Eskola, a remarkable team, I mean it, one of the best teams you'll ever get anywhere. The Star Tribune, the Coles family, bringing in the best journalists from all over the country, building a remarkable team, and always putting community first. University of Minnesota, exciting place. They had a guy named Sibley there when I came. Everybody remember him? He was a socialist, and he threw out these bombs on the campus every other day. I thought I had died and gone to Hog's Heaven. It was paradise. My God, were they alive. So everything was perking and all drawn together by the Citizens League, which was executives of business coming together with labor, political leaders, etc., planning out tomorrow's future, metropolitan governance, environmental controls, all sorts of goals that built Minnesota. When Wendell Anderson's picture was on the cover of Time magazine, notice the lack of partisan response. All of us celebrated and said, we have arrived. Our team, our state has arrived. We don't have it anymore. One, we basically lost the Citizens League. Two, to a large extent, we lost stations like CCO to national financial interest. Three, the Star Tribune's in the business of owning 3 professional sports, expanding the sports section, and in the into the business of receiving government subsidies, and not in the business any longer of setting priorities for the state of Minnesota. How in the world can we as a state afford to put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in building facilities for professional sports that are owned by billionaires, and then announce that we have deficits for our schools? We have people come up here and say that we have students in Bloomington that can't afford extracurricular activities. Why is it when the legitimate, purposeful needs of a state are at stake, we're told, oh, we can't afford that? It's all about sports. It's all about taking money from those who don't have very much and those of us who have just enough and give it to those who are very, very wealthy. And it's about time we began to write letters to the editors and protest. I wrote one last week. It hasn't been published. It probably never will be published.
What's the subject?
When you own 3 professional sports teams and you get subsidies from the public, you have a conflict of interest. Disclose it. How can you hold those people who hold public office to one standard of conduct and then turn around and exempt yourself from the very same one? You can't do it. What does an endorsement from a newspaper mean? Does it mean that we endorse the candidate because that person tends to be generous with the public's money in subsidizing our facilities? Or does it mean, as it used to mean, no, we endorse that candidate because he represents the best for the public? The truth is, today we can't answer that question.
Should we wrap it up, Jim, or you got time for a couple more? Or?
Yeah, look, is there one more question? Oh, 2 more. We'll just do these 2.
Well, as your official portrait in the Capitol demonstrates, you have been a strong advocate for the university. What has changed where university seems to not get the response and to get the kind of funding that a lot of people think it needs?
Well, one, I think, frankly, we need much more competent leadership at the University of Minnesota. It has to be based on a system where we have to focus on defining excellence and holding people's feet to that sense of excellence. 2, boards of regents should not be buddies of legislators. They should represent the best and the brightest that we have in the state of Minnesota. They should be our natural leaders. And thirdly, there should be goals and objectives that are measurable and understandable, so we, the public, understand precisely what it's doing. When you come down all over America, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, every single state, without exception, the highest paid employee in the public sector is a coach. How in the world are we going to win the fight on global competition just because we have a good football team? No, let's start to focus on our priorities. Have discussion groups like this, engage in it. What is our most important? We should be building our faculties, strengthening the whole teaching profession, helping children succeed in this challenging economy. And I love sports, I truly do. But their place is secondary. Okay, I've said enough. I got enough trouble.
That's a good place to end.
Well,
Thank you.
Well, just 1 second. Governor, with the power and conviction of your comments, with the respect this audience has for you, you know, filings don't close until 5 o'clock tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Let me just say this in closing, if I may, and it may be somewhat romantic, but that is, I'd like to see us bring quality back to virtually everything that we do and truly respect it, including governance, including political competition, etc. But I know that the media today is very much under attack. I was so blessed during the 30 years that I spent in public office with incredibly competent people representing the media. I mean that. And they have served you extraordinarily well. And I can honestly and truly tell you there was never anybody better and anybody more thorough and at the same time very kind than Eric Eskola.